Every time you press play on your favorite Spotify playlist, you immediately get lost in the sauce, only to be abruptly yanked back to reality by those pesky ad breaks if you're on the free ad-supported plan. These interruptions serve as a stark reminder of the massive $26 billion music industry, dominated by Universal Music, Sony, and Warner Music. These three oligopolies control 70% of the music recording business and 60% of the music publishing industry. Despite this, very little is covered about their actual business model. Instead, media coverage often fixates on their contentious relationships with streaming platforms like Spotify, or their infamous clashes with global superstars like Taylor Swift, even fueling speculations of foul play between Sony and Michael Jackson.
I'm leaving Sony a free agent of owning half of Sony. I own half of Sony's publishing and I'm leaving them, and they're very angry at me because of it, but I just did good business, you know. The way they get revenge is to try and destroy my album.
To understand the cold relationship between Spotify and record labels and the perpetual disputes between labels and artists, we must follow the money, because ultimately it's always been about the money. While on the surface it might seem like record labels are in the business of making music, their financial records expose a different reality. Movies, games, and music each fall under the vast umbrella of entertainment. But the music industry is unique in how it's set up. Major game publishers like Ubisoft and EA, and movie producers like Lionsgate and Disney, shoulder the full cost of their productions. In stark contrast, the music industry flips this model on its head, transferring all recording and publishing expenses to individual artists. Creating music demands a deep well of creativity that requires artists to be vulnerable, introspective, and deeply connected to their emotions and thoughts. This is essential for making music that resonates globally, transcending different cultures and languages, something they cannot achieve while they are busy thinking of how much tax they owe the IRS or the routing of their tours. To focus exclusively on creating the hits we love, mainstream artists delegate secondary tasks like social media promotion, concert coordination, income tracking from royalties and merchandise, tax compliance, payroll for their teams, and negotiating contracts, to professional teams consisting of personal and business managers, lawyers, agents, and even groupies, all of whom collect retainers and salaries. Personal managers typically take home 15 to 20% of gross earnings from new artists, while business managers, lawyers, and agents may negotiate percentages or charge hourly rates or monthly retainers since they want their own downsides covered, especially when dealing with newer artists that are just breaking into the scene and gaining clout. Moreover, artists shoulder additional expenses for studio time, music videos, songwriters, and producers, who are often paid in royalties derived from the artist's revenues. To afford all these costs, artists have to resort to loans just like Ubisoft and Netflix, and while banks throw themselves over to give these companies huge loans, they are uninterested in loaning out money to artists since they often do not have tangible collateral as security, and their income streams are extremely unpredictable, since they all depend on variable factors such as changing market tastes, touring success, and album sales. However, Universal and Warner Music have billions in assets and consistent cash flows to borrow against, placing them in a perfect position to act as an arbitrage between banks and artists and make billions while at it. Due to their scale, Warner and to some extent Universal Music secure low-interest loans from multinational banks like Credit Suisse, which they then extend to artists as advances at extremely high interest rates. In 2021 alone, Warner Music borrowed $1 billion using $850 million to settle outstanding debts and allocating another $830 million as advances to artists. To understand how record labels recoup these advances, with interests that rival payday loans, let's look at TikTok's current sensation Tyla, and how much she would have to generate in revenues to recoup the $2 million she got after Sony bought her out of her contract. Although her record deal is most likely a 360 deal, meaning Sony also earns from her touring, sponsorships, and merchandising revenue, we'll narrow our focus to streaming revenues from her recorded and published songs, as labels have yet to fully exploit these complementary revenue streams. In 2023, Spotify's total revenues were $14.3 billion, which roughly translate to $1 billion monthly. Spotify uses a pro rata model to pay record labels, which simply means it puts all the revenue it collects in a pool and distributes the money to record labels and independent artists based on their number of streams. If Spotify had a total of 100 billion streams in July and 20 billion streams were from artists signed to Sony Music, it would pay $140 million to Sony. If you are wondering why it's not $200 million, that's because Spotify has to try and make a profit by keeping 30% and paying 70% to record labels. Once Sony receives its share, it then assesses Tyla's streaming numbers. Let's assume she got 60 million streams, which is double her monthly listeners. This accounts for just 0.3% of total streams and revenue, entitling her to $420,000 from Sony. However, she only gets paid in royalties, and new artists like Tyla typically get royalties ranging from 15% to 18%. Using 15%, her earnings for the month would only amount to $63,000. At this rate, it would take Tyla nearly 3 years of consistent performance to recoup the $2 million advance she got, and to actually start earning money from her music, since most record deals dictate artists must first recoup the entire loan amount before earning a single dollar from their royalties. What's even more outrageous is the fact that Tyla would have paid Sony $13 million just to recoup $2 million, a whopping 250% interest rate. From this example, it's quite obvious record labels are not in the business of making music, but rather in the business of giving predatory loans to artists. However, as atrocious as these interest rates might sound, they exist to cover one harsh reality about the music industry. For every breakout star like Cardi B, Burna Boy, or Ed Sheeran, signed by Warner Music, thousands fail to achieve the consistency and global star status needed to recoup their advances, resulting in significant losses. Each year, record labels assess the popularity, sales history, and anticipated commercial success of their artists' work, writing off unrecoverable advances as losses. Notably absent from their financial statements is a specific provision for bad debts. Instead, they highlight their revenues and expenses, giving us an opening to look into their reliance on debt and who actually is pulling the strings behind the scenes at Warner. In 2023, Warner Music reported $6 billion in revenues and an operating profit of $790 million, which was offset by outstanding accounts receivable of $251 million recognized as revenue but not yet received, and $1.1 billion in capitalized advances to artists which were recorded on their balance sheet instead of their income statement. If we factor in these two line items, their $790 million in operating profits is wiped out. Just like Ubisoft, Warner Music instead rely heavily on their operating cash flows, which amounted to $687 million in 2023. They also depend on a line of short-term and long-term debts. Warner Music has a $300 million credit line, which is just like a credit card that allows companies to withdraw large amounts of money and helps them manage their short-term financing and maintain liquidity. Warner's total debt currently stands at $3.9 billion, and due to their heavy reliance on debt financing, the name of the game for Warner is to extend the maturity dates for their outstanding loans, reduce their interest expenses, improve their debt ratings from credit bureaus such as Fitch and S&P, and try to influence Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon, and YouTube as much as possible, since they currently determine whether or not they revert back to the prior debt limitations imposed on them by banks. Before Warner Music successfully renegotiated their debt covenants in 2021, they were on a tight leash held by banks. They could not use their assets as collateral, incur any more debt, pay dividends to its shareholders, and enter into certain transactions with its subsidiaries and affiliates. It's therefore extremely crucial for Warner Music to try and influence their biggest revenue earners, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and Amazon Music. Although subscriber growth is an important growth lever to streaming services, the big three would rather prefer if they prioritize price increases, since they increase their average revenue per user, or ARPU. Although most Apple Music users pay for $11 plan, their average revenue per user is $7 after factoring in discounted family and student plans. Spotify's ARPU is lower, and this is because, unlike Apple Music, where everyone is on a subscription plan, only 236 million users pay for a Spotify subscription out of a total of 602 million users. The other 366 million users are on the free ad-supported plan. Compared to subscription revenue, ad revenues are extremely variable and significantly lower, since Spotify has to play an extremely delicate balancing act between blasting their users with ads or letting them play their music uninterrupted for longer period of times to keep them engaged. As a result, Spotify typically sells fewer ad spots. Ad-supported has generally grown in line with subscription streaming, except with a bit or a sine curve, more cyclical based on how economic factors are doing, but generally tracks that line with more cyclicality based on slowdowns. This revenue mix between ad-supported and subscription revenue makes Spotify's ARPU of $4.70 compared to Apple Music's $7. An increase in prices that results in an uptick of just 20 cents in average revenue per user for Spotify would increase $120 million to Warner's, Sony's, and Universal's revenue pool. However, the opposite is also true. As a result, Universal, Sony, and Warner Music force Spotify and other streaming services to include a per-subscriber minimum when they negotiate their contracts, ensuring a guaranteed amount per subscriber regardless of actual revenue collected. This is meant to discourage streaming services from discounting their prices just to drive up traffic. If Sony, Warner, and Universal Music had their way, Spotify and YouTube Music wouldn't offer free plans, and a subscription would cost $20 per month. Look, I grew up professionally at HBO where price increases were something we did every single year while still growing subscribers. I am hopeful that now the industry has done a round of price increases successfully and continued to grow, they start to understand that customers can bear it and pricing can become part of the industry. In our conversations with distributors, we are doing what we can to try and encourage not just price increases but a recurring set of price increases as part of the industry. Although they can't single-handedly dictate streaming prices, Sony, Warner, and Universal Music have other tricks up their sleeves to protect their bottom line. In 2015, a leaked contract between Sony and Spotify sparked a huge controversy and led to multiple cease and desist letters from Sony to The Verge. Sony claimed the leak was copyright infringement and The Verge had to drop the story. It was such a nightmare for Sony since The Verge had exposed, among other things, that Sony had asked Spotify to pay $42.5 million in advances over the course of their 3-year contract. However, what most articles covering the story overlooked was this provision was a modern breakage fee designed by record labels to protect them from potential losses from damaged or unsold vinyl records and CDs. You would be correct to think such a fee is preposterous in the streaming era. Yet, it has a rationale behind it. Streaming services have a nasty habit of going bankrupt and failing due to losses. For instance, despite being in business for nearly 20 years, Spotify recorded its first-ever profit in Q1 2024, and this was not due to a business model overhaul, but rather cost-cutting measures enforced by Value Act Capital, an activist investment fund who publicly called for spending cuts at Spotify. Spotify was forced to lay off 17% of its staff and scaled back its loss-making podcast division by trimming down the number of shows it was producing. To protect themselves from this unpredictability, especially from newer streaming services, record labels ask for upfront cash advances against future income, which is a breakage fee designed for the streaming era. However, unlike its advances to artists, these are not recoupable. If Spotify went bankrupt after paying only $10 million in streaming revenues, Sony would not be liable to return or recoup the remaining $30 million. The streaming industry also faces a significant dilution problem, made worse by the emergence of AI. Out of the 120,000 tracks uploaded daily, many are AI-generated songs. Ambient sounds like rainfall and river streams, and manipulated versions of popular songs that are sped up, slowed down, or covered by other artists. Compounding this issue are streaming farms which are making bank from artists, and even Swedish street gangs who are willing to pay them to artificially boost their artists' streaming numbers and launder their money through Spotify. All these tracks and streams are included in Spotify's total stream count, diluting the pool of licensed songs, reducing the payouts record labels get from Spotify and other streaming services. To combat this, the big 3 record labels have started adding dilution caps in their contracts with streaming services. These caps put a hard limit on how much of their music revenue can be diluted. Due to defensive maneuvers like these, record labels have earned a tarnished reputation among artists and their fans, who often view them as leeches driven by the greed of monetizing art they never created. Although music is art at its core, it cannot be detached from its potential to make millions for streaming services, artists, and labels who fund these artistic projects. In every business negotiation, a push-pull dynamic exists as each party do their best to protect its interests and bottom line. Spotify, for instance, aims to negotiate lower licensing fees from record labels to achieve profitability and growth. However, unlike Apple Music, YouTube Music, and Amazon Music, which are just subsidiaries of vast, multi-billion-dollar companies, Spotify's negotiating power is significantly weakened due to its lack of differentiation. Artists, on the other hand, seek greater control over their music, how it's distributed, more creative freedom, and guaranteed advances for 2 or more albums. Conversely, record labels want to maintain full control and rights over the music they fund. They resist giving up control because it would jeopardize their advances, increasing their risk of defaulting on loans from banks. This is the same exact situation Ubisoft finds itself in, and if you are interested, I've made a video covering their troubles. These diametric interests between record labels and artists are ultimately the source of all conflicts between them. Sony's, Universal's, and Warner's drive to secure their investments and repay their loans to creditors contrasts sharply with artists' desires for autonomy and better loan rates, creating a complex and often contentious industry landscape.